Life of love. Life of love. With Joy Hilsen.
Hello, dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Life of Love, where we gather each week to bring forth messages for your highest good, to inspire and lift you up and keep your chin up. I mean, things are really crazy lately, and so I know I cherish this time every week to record and create, and this week is a really fun one. I'm tickled delighted to have David Ask on my podcast. He's an entrepreneur, a creative, and an encouraging. Actually, this is the first we've had the most encouraging person on the earth.
I love it.
Welcome to Life of Love, David.
Thank you. Thanks. It's funny. Of course, we met, on online, and in my podcast bio, I often throw that out there. And what's really funny, of course, I'm being a little facetious at the same time, being the best encourager in the world it speaks to that playful side of me, but it also speaks to, a really, really intrinsically motivating place in me that I love to, to loan courage to somebody, or maybe the word is inspire, which means, to breathe life into. And I think that's, one of the reasons that God made me. So thanks for having me.
Oh, sure. I'm a fellow, I like to call myself an activator. Like I activate people to maybe be curious, or maybe I annoy people, and that's another activation. But please, everyone, take what serves you and leave what doesn't. We're all here with a different frequency. So, wow, today I'm just really excited. I always say I'm going to pick someone's brain, but I love how you say you can't stare at your own belly button forever. But let's go there. Let's encourage people to stare at their belly buttons a little bit. And I love that metaphor, because I think of like a pudgy little toddler. And if everyone can think of themselves as their pudgy little 2-year-old selves, and just looking down at your little round belly with no judgments, just curiosity, and be like, Mom, what's that? Let's get there. Let's get there, because I want to talk about getting to know who you are. And to me, that was the foundation of your work, is that your purpose and knowing what you're here for, your why, is only secondary to knowing the who. And that resonated with me so much. So I'd love for you to to share some, background on how you came to that. And I know your story is going to weave into this, because you've had so many entrepreneur successes, and your life has been very rich. So any stories that are relevant, I'm delighted to hear to that too.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, it's interesting. About 6 years ago, I met a guy that's in my mastermind group, Dr. Andy Garrett, and he's a clinical psychologist, and become a dear friend of mine. We work together now quite a bit, and like you kind of mentioned, throughout your life, you have some idea, typically, of kind of what lights you up, what doesn't, your tendencies, proclivities, whatever you want to call it. And I went through his program, which he calls the True North Blueprint. And I love the name around that. And he explains that like this. He says, most people, would say if they want to head in a certain direction, they would grab a compass, and okay, here's north, right? We're going to head there. But what's fascinating is a compass is constantly reading, the magnetic field around it. And you're going to get close to north, right? But whereas true north is like geo points, right? It's a GPS coordinates that are actually defined to a really specific point. The specificity, I like that word, is really clear. And so I think as we're growing up, quite often, we start reading the room. We, like the magnetic field, as it were, right? We're kind of playing a little bit of a role, especially early on. We get rewarded for certain behaviors, right? We get claps and smiles, or we might get, a funny look, or, somebody gets mad at us, or that kind of thing, if we, do certain things. So we're kind of, conditioned, as it were, to, to start playing a little bit of a role. And, of course, when we, start to mature in our ability to think and so on, we then have the luxury to start, identifying, right? The word identity, what God made in us. and we're incredibly unique from a really early age. And I think it's really fascinating when you start to identify those things with specificity, how you start to feel more comfortable in your own skin, and you kind of predetermine the things that you're going to say yes and no to, in advance of an obstacle or an opportunity. And I think it's really important to have clarity around who you are, because then you're, like you mentioned, your why starts to take shape of the who, as opposed to if you don't have that question answered, your why might be somebody else's why.
Right. You could be influenced. You could be distracted from what
Yeah.
your. I like to. I got into like values, and it
Yeah.
it became more when I became a mom,
Sure.
because I wanted to know like our family values, like what are we going to fall back on?
Yeah.
And I always like sports, and so we always have this metaphor of we're a team with our family, and
Yeah.
what's your role right now, and everyone switches roles every once in a while, but like that value of being dependable, being honest, being true to somebody,
Yeah.
being so it's always something that you explore on your own, but maybe not everyone has gone down that road
Sure.
to do that. So it's a little bit like, well, was this something that served me, or is this something that served whatever I was brought up in, and maybe it's not valid anymore? So there's questions to be asked, and I love how that true north is, that's a really elusive thing. You just try to get as close as you can, and if you ever think about it, north is straight up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Compasses are strange things if you really think about it. It's like this needle going on
Yeah.
this plane. I was trying to explain it. I was like, well, we never go straight up. We're going north on the grid. We're
Sure.
going. It's sort of funny.
Yeah.
So that relativity is always something that can keep you curious about. Well, this is my north right now, but tomorrow it might be different, and it's okay. There's a needle adjusting, and you're looking for the best you can do.
Mm.
So, and that gives us grace, I guess, to accept where we are.
I love that you said, by the way, your team, and your family and so on. I think it's really important to have, an identity as a family, especially when your kids are young. In fact, years ago for Christmas, I had my last name is actually pronounced Osk. My heritage is Norwegian. There's a town in Norway named Osk, but I had Team Osk shirts made, and in fact, we're going to surprise now my teenage children with new Team Osk some hats and shirts for Christmas this year and so on. But
Nice.
it's fascinating because I that kind of a macro identity, as the I take my role as the dad very seriously, and I want to lead my family well, and and with clarity and honesty and integrity and love and everything. And I think it was Seth Godin who first coined that phrase, people like us do things like this. And I really I think that's fascinating. Not only of course, when you're leading young children, you should have a real a clear sense of direction, and that clear sense that, hey, people like us do things like this. Children especially are looking for certainty, but also, of course, as an individual, it's really it's fascinating that when you say someone like me, I do things, it's powerful, because if you don't have a sense of that, if there's a kind of a vague understanding, you kind of have that question mark inside of you, and then kind of the reading the room, as it were, kind of takes over, and you start playing a role again, as opposed to having real clarity on how I want to show up, for, of course, those I love. But I mean, heck, what if I'm at the grocery store or gas station, or, whatever that might be? I don't want to have a question mark as opposed, as in that area that, those things that I value, and the type of impact I want to have and so on.
That's so beautiful. And to me, it's like knowing your divinity. Like people like us do things like this. It's like you have this inner, and it's not arrogance. It's your identity. It's your knowing you're dignified, that
Yeah.
your presence is impactful, and also the free will that this is our choice. It's just on so many levels. It's great
It's,
because they
it's
get into
kind
that.
of neat. I remember when I started hanging out with Dr. Andy, he started, kind of clarifying some things in this arena, like around the vocabulary, for instance, the word authenticity, in and of itself, that word and even identity are quite misused quite often. And, I like, for instance, the word authenticity, where do we even get that word? And it comes from the word author. And what I think is really fascinating is um, we do have a lot of free will, but there are some things that, of course, we didn't choose. We can't choose. I mean, for instance, I didn't make me, right? I didn't choose my eye color, my taste buds, my skin color, and things like that. I mean, and here's a fascinating thing. And I mean, since you have children, you'll kind of get this. We don't really even choose our own personalities. We get to choose what we do with those things. But, those of us who have kids, we know that they come out of the gate really different. I'm talking weeks and especially months old. You can tell, the little spirit in your child is just so different. What I mean, it's almost hard to describe in some way, but of course, everything from what makes them cry to laugh, or their different tendencies and so on, from an early age, it's so wonderful how unique they are. We've got a DNA, a fingerprint, and a retina that's very, very different. But what's really neat is children are not, I guess, stuck in their heads like we are quite often, where they're, I mean, children of up until, 5 or 6 or 7 years old or something, they're not thinking about, I want to be authentic. I want to express my identity. They're just doing their deal.
Mm-hmm.
But what, right? But when the world, hurts, when you start to, you get insulted or teased or bullied, or, there's some type of an external influence that, hurts, well, then you start questioning a lot of that stuff. Am I good enough? Am I, are those things that, that are really natural to me, what if somebody doesn't like that? So you kind of, quite often, you start shutting down in some of those ways. And, we think of, students in school with peer pressure and things like that. It's amazing how some of that stuff takes over. Um, Dr. Andy was explaining one time, the clinical term self-actualization. Of course, teenagers, they get into that mode where quite often, parents are like, man, those teen years were hard. They start pushing back and testing boundaries and all that kind of thing. But it's really a natural time, for a young person to start carving out, those things that are very natural to them. And, sometimes that can get a little sticky and, whatever else. But I think it's wonderful that, when someone starts to, again, identify, literally write down, those things that are most true about them. And they start acting in alignment with, again, that, your authenticity, you start to feel authentic, you start to feel natural, you start to feel comfortable in your own skin. But when you don't, of course, you start to feel anxious, you start to feel imposter syndrome, you start to question, are these people going to like me? And sometimes apathy and avoidance and things like that can take over. So I think it's really important to, be asked the right questions and to identify the most powerful, precious, courageous, goosebump driven places in us, and remove that big question mark.
I love that. And I don't know if you want to share any of the Toy Story metaphor that you sent me before we connected.
So, it's funny. One morning I woke up and yeah, my mornings are typically, get up, grab my coffee, pet the dogs, and I'll sit down and, read, pray, and journal and so on. And I remember praying that morning, like, God, show me something this morning that I need to hear. And I wrote a little bit of a short story about an orphan out in an alleyway. And so I'll kind of tell that story just briefly. It might be a little long for a podcast, but so you picture maybe yourself, as an orphan out in an alleyway. Your home is made of, pallets and old blankets and some, tin roofing, and it's cold and it's dark, and there's that, and nobody cares about you. And the story goes that one day the orphan decided to look in the window of the toy store that he was next to, and when he looked in the window, the toy maker was staring through that small pane of glass that he was, had dared to look through, and they made eye contact. And of course, the orphan was startled by that and kind of recoiled back into the night. But as he was sitting there, he was thinking, very curiously, what was the expression on his face? It seemed so good. It seemed so inviting. So the next day he, says, all right, I'm going to go back and look and just check it out again. Right. But his heart was telling him, maybe there's somebody in there that cares about me. So when he looks back in the window, the toy maker was looking in the same direction as if he'd never taken his eyes away from that pane of glass. And he looks into the eyes of the orphan and smiles and motions, come on in here. And of course, in that moment, the orphan starts to hear some music, and he feels the ground under him moving until he's standing inside next to the toy maker. And the toy maker looks at him and says, hey, welcome. Glad you're here. Puts his arm around him and smiles and chuckles. And just then, one of the workers in this, this incredible toy store, grabs him by the hand and says, hey, I need your help over here. Would you help me? And he's swept into, the revelry, the beauty, the mission that's on hyperdrive inside of this toy store, right? They're making toys. They're packaging things up. They're sending things out. They're meeting people at the curb. And they're on a mission, right, to make beautiful things for beautiful people. And it's not long, right? The same day, the orphan realizes that nobody cares about his dirty and very unacceptable clothing. He's part of this good and great work. And, he's kind of invited into that world, into that family. And what was interesting as I was kind of processing that journal entry is really what it was. I was kind of picturing myself, as the orphan, because I think there's an orphan in all of us, right?
Yeah.
We get up in the morning and we're like, man, am I good enough, right? Are people going to want to hear what I have to say? What if I share something that's really powerful and meaningful to me, and the response I get is not, what I was hoping, or I get rejected? There's that scared person in all of us. And at the same,
that hit me. That's when I read it. I was like, well, I'm an
yeah,
orphan, and God is inviting me into the toy store.
yeah. And what if, every one of us, could become the toy maker, right? Like, what would it look like, for David and Julie to be looking around and saying, hey, come over here a second. Whether you're in a lunchroom with a bunch of kids, right, and there's somebody sitting alone, or whatever that looks like. I love the idea of finding the loneliest person in the room and saying, hey, dude, come over here. You belong here. But here's the fascinating thing. For me, it's not just about belonging, right? It's not just about feeling safe and wanted. That should be a given. We were made for a purpose. There's work to be done. And whether it's a blade of grass or, really everything we can see, taste, and touch was created for a purpose. Maybe not wasps. I like to clarify that because I don't like wasps. You know what I mean? It's like, everything was made for a reason. And especially human beings, right? We are those who can think about our own thinking. We are those who have eternity, woven into us. And I just think that, right now, of course, my main mission is dads, but I think in general, people, they don't see that. They don't understand that they were made, of the great one. And they, not only do they not see that for themselves, they don't see that in others. They treat themselves poorly and they treat others poorly. And I think that identity, right, is getting back to this idea that the great author, wrote something, and I'm talking to the DNA level, right? Your DNA is something that can never be replicated statistically. It can't. It's billions of pieces of information that make you, so unique. And man, I love this idea of shining a spotlight on people's uniqueness, saying, hey, you belong here. What do you want to do? We've got work to do. Like we're on mission to sabotage, darkness. And I feel like, that's what causes me to get up in the morning.
I know whenever I second guess like my my podcast or any even, and that's why I start every time. I'm like, God, work through me and for me to bring forth that message, because I know that if I put it in his hands, it's all going to be the way it should be. And
Yeah.
that's how I get the courage to come and be myself and show up and know that I have the best comment or question at that moment for whatever reason. So yeah, I
Awesome.
just
Absolutely.
appreciate your take on it, because it resonates, and I think it's important to just be vulnerable and say, yeah, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to put yourself
Totally
out
is.
there. And
Yeah. You're darn right.
yeah,
It's hard. Life is hard. It's there. You know, I think you and I are probably kindred spirits in the fact that, you know, I don't necessarily want to think about the hard stuff, right? I want to focus on the good things. At the
mhm,
same time, you know, there's this idea of salty and sweet, right? You can't know the good unless you have, you know, the salt. I mean, it's like there's, you know, that you can't have one without the other. And I think too that, you know, this idea of mission is just so important to all of us. You mentioned at the beginning, by the way, you know, staring at your own belly button, and of course, I'm having a little fun with that. But I think it's
so
really
good.
important. You know what? You do need to stare at yourself for a while and build some self awareness and drive a stake in the ground, as opposed to, you know, those values, convictions, virtues, which are all different, by the way. You know, goosebumps. What is it? I like. It's from a Nissan commercial. What gives your goosebumps? Goosebumps. You know, those things that just really, really make you come alive, and the things that you really believe. And to have a vague understanding of that, you're probably going to be a bit, well, how should I say it? You're going to lack, I think, impact. You're going to have
Mhm.
a bit of a watered down impact on your family, especially, and you know, and those that are around you. And when you get really clear on that stuff, then you can have a really clear impact on people, and it's just really fun to be yourself.
Yeah. And then I saw it somewhere, it was written, it said, other people's opinions of you are none of your business.
Isn't that great? Yeah,
I love that one. Like, yeah, that's so good.
yeah.
Like, I'm
And
just doing the best I can.
well, and of course, you know, when we think of that, we think of, you know, negativity or something, somebody saying something that, you know, would be a detractor of some sort. But here's what's awesome. You know, I know that there's a few people that I've even met lately that I've never met in person. And, you know, they've found some posts that I made and they've reached out and so on. And I've had some conversations with some men. And after talking to them, I can tell that no one has ever affirmed them. No one has ever validated, you know, their greatest good. No one has ever said, you know, hey, dude, you're made of awesome, and you know, I want to get the shovel out and start digging here. And of
Mm,
course, you know, I like this idea of, you know, as a dad doing that for my kids, and I think it's really important. I don't know if I sent this in my email to you, but the my favorite quote, and I think you're going to love this, is by a guy named Benjamin Disraeli. He's a former PM of England back in the day, but he uses or he used the phrase, the greatest good you can do for another is not to share with him your riches, but to reveal to him his own. And I just think what a mandate, you know, for people to live a life where you're looking at someone else, but in the back of your mind, right, you've got a shovel and you're kind of digging for some stuff. And when they do or say something, or you can tell they're stepping out of their comfort zone and doing something that's meaningful or daring, you know, you're like, hey, I saw that.
I
That
see
that
you.
was really good. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, what a gift to give somebody.
Oh, yeah. I mean, people have no idea how that acknowledgement can be so
Yeah,
powerful. So that segues into your mission with boys and your Guardians of Grit.
yeah, yeah,
Um, I really wanted to have we have like a few more minutes to talk, but I don't want to brush through it, because
yeah,
for
yeah,
me this sacred masculine is so precious.
yeah,
And so if you'd like to share about that and what you're doing for our sons, I mean,
yeah, yeah. I really have a heart. You know, I had a great father, and I so appreciate, you know, the values and things that he instilled in me. There was never a day that I didn't hear from him, "Hey, I love you," you know, and you know, probably a bear hug. I mean, literally every day of my life. And so many don't get that. And the reason that I chose, you know, the book title that I'm working on, Guardians of Grit, is two reasons really. You know, you cannot give away something you don't have. So I really believe that if fathers are going to raise uncrushable, right, they're going to get knocked down and beat up, right? That's life. But
Mm-hmm.
to become uncrushable means I have an internal constitution. I have the values and the convictions and virtues and all those things identified that fuel, right? I mean, everything from eternal beliefs to, who I am and what my mission is, plus a support system, right? To do hard things over a long period of time, right? Grit, because what's on the other side of that hill is worth fighting for. If you want to build a beautiful life for yourself and those you love, you're going to have to do hard things. And by the way, that might mean you just have to have a conversation tonight. A long period of time is a matter of perception. It might be a long day knowing that you're going to have a conversation tonight, that might be difficult and awkward. But guess what? So many people don't even have those moments, right? Let
Right.
alone
Right.
doing other things, that might take weeks, months, or years. And so I think that for me, it's really about, this idea of, hey, Dad, I want to introduce you to yourself so that you can hold up a mirror to your son and say, hey, do you see what I see? Let's start mining for gold. Whatever you're into, I'm into. Whatever lights you up, I'm going to get under that and lift it up as high as I can. This idea of raising children, what does that really mean? It's causing them to rise and out of insecurity, out of imposter syndrome, out of fear, things like that. And so and here's something else too. I mean, even scriptures say that above all, guard your heart. So I really believe that guardian of grit is really more about, guarding your heart. It's the absolute wellspring of life. And if you don't understand what it is, where it is, and that you really should be guarding it, you're going to have a lot of influences and things that you bring into your life that'll probably take you off track.
Yeah. And it's just so relevant to me right now because I've been reading the Aramaic interpretation of the Lord's Prayer, the
Interesting.
original,
I have never read that. That's fascinating.
and it part of it, the prayer is honoring that sacred place in your heart, and that's part of the original what Jesus said in his native tongue to the common people in Aramaic.
Hmm,
Um, and it's
that's
just been
interesting.
really, really great. And like
Yeah.
the the visualization that you're guided to go through when you're reading this. Anyone wants to look into it, it's a great. I'll put the book in the show comments because it's just I keep rereading. It's not a big book. I keep rereading it in the action steps at the end of each line. It's like it hits me different every time I read it. So I know it's
Interesting.
deep.
I've never heard of that. I'd like
It's
to.
very deep.
I'll look into that too. That's
But you
great.
spend a lot of time with the sound and the word, and then you let it resonate in your heart chamber. In your heart chamber is the sacred place where your God is, where your divinity is, and it's just gooey. It's just
Mm,
really wonderful. And the more you can come back to that, and I think that's what people sometimes get out of meditation, but there's many different ways to get to that. Maybe it's listening to birds or having quiet time or whatever brings you to that the calm. It's like this theta brain wave. You're not asleep, but everything's just really calm.
hmm.
And then you connect
Interesting.
to your heart. So yeah, it was one of the reasons I really love to get into my crystal my sound bath crystal bowls is because that really gets into my heart,
Hmm.
and then I try to share that light. But yeah, so when you say this, about how you guard your heart, the guardians of grit, it's so pertinent, and that's going to give us strength to be authentic and show our kids that it's worthwhile,
Hmm.
to be yourself. And you're right. It's us showing up, and then the world's not such a crazy, limitless place when there's foundations and even limitations. I remember when my little boy, my 21-year-old was 2, and I'd be like, Reese, you have you have boundaries. Like you can't do this. This is a boundary. And you'd be like, I have boundaries. Like, yes, you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was so fun. That's what I love. People say terrible twos. I say terrific twos. I think the 2-year-old, because they're so authentic. I mean, they can go from a scream down fit to
Yeah.
like just complete nap within 30 seconds. It's so fun. It's
Isn't that
like
great? Yeah.
they're
I
just
remember those times well. Yeah,
raw.
absolutely. Yeah. I remember, you said something that made me think of this idea of, there's a friend of mine, actually had breakfast with him this morning. He has a kind of a men's mission, and it revolves around the word plumb line, and I love this idea. Dr. Andy talks about, course correcting, quite often, right? Because, on any given day, we're
Yeah.
kind of, back and forth and back and forth. But I think it's so important, again, kind of have those GPS coordinates or a plumb line that you're measuring, as it were, everything else against, that straight edge. And so I think it's, so many people, it's, I don't know, they've just never been introduced to that concept. It's more about what kind of feels good in the moment as opposed to what reality is. And I think it's really important that, we live in a world with boundaries, right? We live in a world that, that there's some confines and things like that. And, that freedom is I think sometimes, kind of misunderstood. There's, if you act inside of your nature, I mean, on a physical level, right? If I go in the ocean and try to act like a shark, I'm not going to thrive. And
Right.
if I try to act like my older brother, right? Seriously, if I start looking up to somebody, whether it's somebody on TV or some talking head that I admire, and I've never done that work internally, and I try to act like someone else or be, take on their cause or whatever that is, it's going to feel very unnatural. It's going to be exhausting, for one thing, but it's going to feel very, very debilitating in a lot of ways. But when we've, gained radical clarity on what that plumb line is for ourselves, again, mind, body, and spirit, what do you believe that, this idea of, I like you mentioned values. I can't imagine there's many people listening to this who haven't heard the term core values,
Mhm.
but I like to kind of flip it on its head or drive it home a bit further and say, what does your core happen to value? And what's really fascinating is you know, going through Dr. Andy's program, there's a core values assessment. He has a bit of a different take on it, but it's interesting because in the English language, and wherever whatever language you speak, you have to kind of choose your words. But there's roughly 80 or so core values in the English language, and of course there's some overlap. But what's interesting is when you start, put a check mark next to the ones that kind of resonate with you, and you narrow that down to 10, you narrow that down to 5. It's neat how it's very different for each person, and if you
Mhm.
put those in order, it's fascinating how you start to describe your core. These are some things that are really immovable, inside of me. And then, of course, convictions are different than values, right? Convictions are, what do you believe is right and wrong? And so you start nailing some of those things down. And then virtues, which is this idea of, dent in the universe, right? Like what impact do I want to have on others? And when people start to identify those things, with real clarity, again, write them down, identify those things. It's fascinating how that plumb line becomes something that is very comforting. It's very, you're describing, your true essence. You're
Mhm.
describing your soul, as it were. And so when you're in the ditch, or you're feeling fragmented or overwhelmed, or whatever that is, it's not a matter of what you're course correcting to, it's who you're course correcting to. And I think it's really important to establish those things. And otherwise, it's you get up in the morning and lick your finger and stick it in the air, and see which way the wind is blowing, and here we go. And that is an
Right.
absolute recipe for disaster.
Mhm. You're right. And you'd pick certain friends to hang out with.
Yeah,
You'd feed yourself certain things because you'd
totally.
realize how the the food that isn't optimal for you isn't serving you, and it
Yeah,
it it just seems to make things simple.
yeah. I love
But not
that.
easy, but
No, yeah,
simple.
but here's the funny thing: the simplicity around it. Yeah, you really nailed it. And at the same time, it does become easier. If we walk into a room, as it were, and we're there maybe to sell something, right? You're at work or you're at a convention, and and you don't have that internal constitution. What's really happening is you're looking for something. You're looking to be fed. You're looking to be told something, as opposed to feeling very full of heart. And now you're scanning the room thinking, who needs David Osk right now? Right? I'm looking for the lonely person in the room, and because I'm not the lonely person in the room anymore. And there's a big difference. And I think that the internal posture reflect our external, mission in a very, very quick way.
Yeah. And to me, that's ultimate timeline shifting, because things can happen really fast when you tune into that, and
Yeah.
life can change in just a perception.
Yeah,
So
it
I want to
changes. Yeah,
hold on
I'm,
to
I'm with
that.
you. Yeah, the perspective on things is I've actually made a post about that on my Facebook page a couple of days ago. And perspective it's really fascinating how it can change, your view of things in a real hurry.
My goodness. Well, we're coming up on our time, and I'm really happy about what came forward, and I want to give you a chance to, if there's anything else you want to share, anything on your heart.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm just really, really glad to be here with you. I think that I always like to leave people with that quote, from Disraeli. It's like, to me, that's how you love somebody, right? The greatest good that you can do for another is not to share with him your riches, although there's some of that that's kind of fun and great. But the greatest good is to reveal to him his own. So, what would that look like, if your posture towards especially your children and your spouse is more akin to, hey, do you see what I see? You're just made of something spectacular, and I really want to get behind that. I want to get underneath that so I can lift it up. And I think that to love someone's character, to love someone's values, to love someone's goosebumps, right? That's about as good as it gets. So
It is.
it's a
And
great place to start.
I struggled with that at first because I was raised in a very competitive household, 4 kids, and
I
just
bet. Yeah.
everything was competition.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I love sports so much, because I could go out in the field or the court or the
Sure.
cross country chat track and just, show my parents that I was valid and worthy,
Yeah.
whatever. In the same respect, I knew that I wanted to value, and I wanted to do it a little differently, because sometimes I studied child psychology in college, like I
Yeah.
studied speech language development, and I know how important these years are where you're raising your kids and they're getting their identity. But even so, I had trouble finding the words to say it that it didn't sound phony. So
Right.
I had to start with like little things, like not little things, but it's like, honey, you worked really hard all day. I know you saw a lot of my husband's a foot and ankle surgeon. I'll be like, I know
Yeah.
you helped a lot of people today, and I can tell. And so I just started bringing up things that I could see that he did, and and even acknowledging when it's harder, when things aren't easy, to acknowledge that they're not easy and that it's okay, and just validating
Yeah.
that someone's struggling, or validating that someone's having a bad day, is so freeing, because then they're like, they don't have to pretend like they're having a good day, because
Isn't that a
that's
gift? Isn't that
yeah.
such a gift? I heard somebody use the phrase the other day, just hold space for someone. And it's a real gift to, yeah, when you can tell someone's, having a hard day, or they tell you something, and just to sit there, with them. I remember one day my sister, she and I are very close, and she probably knows me better than I know me, but she called me one day and she said, "Hey, can I just sit with you? Like, we're on a phone call." And I'm like, what? She goes, "I just want to sit with you in silence today." And I'll be honest, like, it was one of the most powerful 15 minutes I had had in years.
Oh my gosh, I
And
just want to cry. That is so beautiful.
yeah. And I mean, I feel like I probably need to give that gift to somebody else. I just thought of that. I hadn't thought about that
Mhm.
in quite some time here until you kind of mentioned that. And
Yeah.
that train of thought there. But I mean, It's really amazing how complex we are, right?
Mhm.
I mean, there's so many complexities and that can change from day to day. But then there's also things in us that are absolute bedrock. There are things that don't change. So
Mhm.
I think it's really important to stand upon the rocks, right, that we build our lives upon that are values, virtues based, and identify those. Literally, just write them down. Somebody just needs to ask you those questions in the right format and the right progression. And it's amazing how you can nail down your identity. It's not,
Mhm.
it's not, woohoo nonsense. It's quite
No.
practical, in fact. But at the same time, inside of that, right, how are you going to wield, like a
Yeah.
sword, how are you going to wield all of that, beautiful complexity to love the person next to you? Because
Right.
that's what life is all about. I'll make one last comment here. I heard someone say that life is all about relationships. And then he stopped and he said, it's all relationship. The
Mhm.
rest is a context. We were made for relationships. The rest is a context to experience relationship in. That doesn't mean we can't enjoy lakes and mountains and music and the whole nine yards, right? But picture this. If you're standing, next to the Grand Canyon, or you're walking around in your own castle for 10 years alone, it becomes a prison, right? It becomes nothing. But if you're walking around in your castle, which might be a beautiful tent in your backyard, by the way, with your kids, it becomes glory. It's everything, right? It's all relationship. It's the relationship that gives meaning to laying in a tent in your backyard with your children, and you don't care that it's not a castle because they're with you. So I think it's really important to keep the main thing, and that's, always people.
But I do have to share. This is part of my book. I have a whole thing of values,
Okay.
and I have my readers pick their value, the top five, and
Yeah,
then their dream life. They put their values in their star.
that's awesome.
But I was guided to the angels helped me write my book, so I think we have some of the same God influence that we're like looking at this stuff, and I'm taking it from my feminine, and you're bringing in your masculine, and I just love when the roads um, converge.
Hmm.
So just
Well,
delighted to have this space with you today. Thank you.
thanks for having me.